So we started last week looking at the early church. We had just finished the book of Acts in our daily readings and thought it would be a good idea to maybe kind of give a top-level overview of where the early church was going, the things that they were working through, and to learn some of the lessons that they were learning as they were becoming a church. Now, the first lesson is that we can't be the early church. We can't do things exactly as they did. We aren't first century Jews and Gentiles. I mean, it makes some logical sense that we can't do that. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from them. And so as we went through that, we saw some of the themes that they were working through of commitment and creativity and adaptation as they were getting things started. And we were in chapter 4, where we saw that there was this snapshot of the early church at that moment that was telling us some of the things that they were doing, that they were sharing what they had, giving to others, they were focused on the mission, and they had an abundance of grace. That's the piece of this that we're going to come back to pretty regularly throughout. And as we did that, we said there were some questions that were going to come up from this. And the questions we can draw out of that are, what am I committing to? What's our mission and how do we do it? And where is our focus? Now, those are good questions, but the most important thing that is underlying all of this is that last statement from Acts 4, verse 33, an abundance of grace was at work among them all. That is the thing that we need to see most often. Now, we can take that and we can read through that story, and we read through it pretty quickly. Like, we made it through the book of Acts relatively quickly, in about 2.5 weeks, I think, if I remember right. So it can be easy to go, well, man, they just had it. They just did good, didn't they? Now, we have to be careful we don't fall into the old adage of it's easier said than done, because there's a whole lot that is taking place inside of that story where every once in a while we get these momentary snapshots of where the church is to kind of help us keep track of what they were doing. But there was a lot of struggle, though, that they were facing. But they were struggling in predictable ways. And that's something that is good for us to see, is that, yes, they were struggling, but it's almost like we could predict kind of how they were going to struggle and what they were going to face as they were growing. Because remember, what we talked about last week was they went from being a group of 12 disciples that were scattered at Jesus' death to being just less than 300 years later, numbering somewhere around 30 million followers, which at the time was an enormous rate of growth. So how did they get there? I don't remember exactly how I ran across this article, but here a while back, in preparing for this, I ran across an old Harvard Business Review article from 1972. Now, it wasn't quite as old when I got it, but they reprinted it with an update in 1998. So a little bit more recent, but still a ways back there. But it was by a guy named Larry Greiner, and he talks about these five phases of growth. And basically, and he says, the main thing he says in there, you're going to hit each of these phases as you are trying to grow, but at each point along the way, you're going to have predictable places where you're going to struggle, and here's how you're going to struggle. And I looked at that and I said, well, that looks an awful lot like the early church, because take a look at where we start. The first phase is creativity. And that is Jesus and his disciples and in their ministry. He was upending all sorts of norms and standards and everything, and he was doing things in a way that folks didn't expect. Kind of the definition of creativity. But Greiner says the first crisis that an organization has when you are in that phase, as you are working to grow and you're moving on to the next one, is a crisis in leadership. Where did that crisis come from? Jesus died. He died, was resurrected, and ascended into heaven. It's a pretty big crisis in leadership. Nowadays, we actually have a term for this. This is an extreme example of this, but nowadays we have a term for this. We call this founder syndrome. It is what happens when the founder of I've read about this mostly in nonprofits, but it's the founder of a nonprofit or a business or an institution, when they are no longer the leader, what do you do next? Most places do not have the literal Son of God there to prepare folks for this, so the early church had an advantage in working to overcome this. And Jesus knew it was coming, and so he had prepared them for this, because the solution to their crisis in leadership was the day of Pentecost. was the moment when the disciples received the Holy Spirit that Jesus told them was coming and had been preparing them for so that they'd be ready for it. When they come out of the building, having received the Holy Spirit, they see the crowds of people that are gathered, and they start talking to him, and Peter takes up his place as leader among the disciples, and he gives the first and one of the greatest sermons that we read in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament, and establishes that. So now we have this new place of leadership. We've moved into the second phase. This is the direction of now we've got good leadership, we've got good management, and things are beginning to go beyond there. But there's some trouble that comes with that, and that is that you get to that, and one of the things we have to recognize as anything grows is that there is only so much anyone can do before you reach the end of what you are capable of, and some of that. And it doesn't matter how good your technological systems are. It doesn't matter how good a spreadsheet I can build. There's only so far that it's going to go before it will reach the end of its capacity. And you need something else. This is where the next crisis point comes in. You begin to have good direction, you've got good leadership, but then becomes the crisis of what Greiner calls autonomy. Something is going to happen that's going to interrupt this. And we see this. This is where we are in Acts chapter 6 right now. That's this next crisis point in there. Because they're growing, and there are growing pains that are associated with this. And as that happens, conflict arises, as Luke tells us in Acts chapter 6, between the Aramaic-speaking and the Greek-speaking disciples. At some point, if you want to, we can go into more detail about what they were in conflict over, but just know they were in conflict with one another, and they had to figure out a way through that. And they do figure out their way through that. We're going to come back to that. But they find how it gets them to the next stage, which they reach that delegation where you've got more leaders that are out there, and that is a good thing. They reach the next crisis point as they're continuing to grow. And we're going to kind of work through a little bit more speedily the next parts of these. This next crisis point is one of control. Now, most places when they do this, they don't lose the literal city in which they had their headquarters. But one of the crises that came up was that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, where Peter and the rest of the disciples and the early leadership of the church, they were based in Jerusalem, and now they couldn't be there anymore. But also they were experiencing more of those growing pains because now they were starting to grow in places that they didn't ever expect. This is where we see Paul coming onto the scene, and he's reaching out to the Gentiles, and they were going, we don't know what to do with this. This was not at all in any of the plans that we had for how we were going to go, but yet here they are. And so they had to figure out how to make this work. And they did. And what we see develop out of that is Paul and other missionaries that were out there would write letters back and forth to these regional churches that were loosely connected to one another so that they could coordinate things. It's why we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It's why we have Ephesians and Philippians and those places. That was how they were kind of coordinating things. Still kind of loosely connected, bound together by these folks who were doing the teaching, and Paul, who just didn't ever get off a boat most of the time, unless it was a shipwreck. And they were going and they were keeping everyone connected. And then beyond that, the next crisis comes and leads them. Ultimately, we get to the last phase that Greiner has on there. It's called collaboration. Now, the thing to know about any time you see a model like this, whether it is 5 phases of growth or 7 steps to something else, or 10 acts of whatever, or 12, it always comes in like 5, 7, 10, or 12. Seems to be this is the number of things that people will put together to give you a list of, right? And the last one is always aspirational, because that's always the goal that you're headed towards, right? That very few people ever get to, because it's aspirational. It is hard work to get there. It's that collaboration phase that's that last one for Greiner on there. We're going to come back to that towards the end, because that will help us to understand our own direction of where we're going and where we're watching the church go. But we go back to Acts chapter 6, the current crisis that we find everybody in. And this is, they are there and they are struggling, and we need to know, how did they get to this point of crisis? The first thing to remember is always this: an abundance of grace was at work among them all. This is the piece that underlies all of this. Because they had to figure out, they were in conflict with each other. How do they get through this? This is not the first time in Scripture that we see this kind of conflict arise. Maybe with this particular topic, but it's not the first time we see this conflict or this solution. In fact, this is the second best known time that this kind of solution is offered. The first time comes all the way back in Exodus chapter 18, all the way back towards the very beginning. You may remember this story. Moses has led the people out of Egypt, right? And they're there and they're doing good and they're starting to figure out who they are. Remember that what we're struggling with in Exodus is that here are these people that had been in slavery for generations at this point, used to their Egyptian overseers telling them exactly what to do, so they didn't know how to govern themselves, they didn't know how to be a people, and all they knew was how to follow directions because that was all of the freedom they had been given, right? Now they're their own people. They are the 12 tribes wandering out in the wilderness. They're this new fledgling little nation state that is constantly on the move. And Moses found himself in the middle of this, spending all of his time resolving conflicts between people. Right? Isn't this what happens if you, like, we don't know this, but if you have more than one kid, you go from being able to do lots of different things to constantly separating fights between your kids. There was Moses. Moses didn't know what to do. He's got all of these people. He's supposed to be leading them, and he is spending all day like this, going, y'all, what are we supposed to do? In conversation with his father-in-law, Jethro, who was a well-respected leader in his own right, comes up to Moses and says, dude, that's a literal translation out of Hebrew, by the way. It says, dude, you can't keep doing this. You are, for your own health, for your own sanity, for your own peace of mind, for your people, you can't keep doing this. You need people to help you to handle all of these things so you can lead. Jethro says, appoint some people to handle these day-to-day things, people that you trust and you know will do a good job. And Moses appoints the first judges to handle all of these day-to-day conflicts so that Moses can be about the work of leading. And exactly the same thing happens in Acts chapter 6. The disciples who were in charge come back and say, here's what we're going to do. We need to be out there leading. We need to be out there preaching. We need to be out there doing these things. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to appoint choose 7 people from among you to basically take up the role as judges so they can handle the conflict that we have here. Now here's what I love about what is happening in this place, in this moment, is that they're beginning to recognize some important things. And the important things that they're recognizing is that there is a limit to what you can do. There's a limit to what we can do as individuals, and we are fallible, and we're going to have problems, and we're going to have these crisis points that come up there. And so, like, for me, this is like in all of these phases, this is like one of the big hinge points in there, that you have to learn this basic lesson that you're limited in what you can do, but you can expand what you can do as a group together. And that's what we see happening here, is they're expanding what they can do by saying, all right, there's only so much we can do, but if we add some more people to this, we can make this work. This is the same thing in a more informal way that we're going to see Paul doing later on as he goes about his ministry. For those of you that are in Sunday school and you're listening to these stories of all these folks, most of these folks are beneficiaries of Paul's teachings and his directions and his mentorship. And not just Paul, you can toss Peter in there and several others, that they were folks who had learned from them and then were going out to teach and to preach. This is the basics of evangelism. Evangelism is not just about being able to tell someone your story of faith. Evangelism is just as much about, or you can make an argument that evangelism is almost more about creating new leaders. Because these are the people that are going to go out. Paul is training his folks, his mentees, folks like Timothy, and you can toss Stephen in there, and Barnabas, and Priscilla, and Aquila, and all of these others whose names I forget and I can't pronounce because Brenda did a much better job at that than...
I looked it up.
It's Brenda, she looked it up. She did a much better job of pronouncing those names than I do sometimes. And these folks that were learning not just how to share their story, but were learning how to lead and to bring others and to then teach them so they could go out and do the same. They were increasing their capacity and their ability as a people, as believers, through this. Because they recognized that they were limited, but that didn't have to keep them in one place. So what does that mean as we look towards what comes in the future? This is where you all never see this, but as I write my sermons up, I have little section headings, and this is the big, hairy theological point. I thought I'd share that one with you today because it was just fun when I typed that down there. And I say it's big and hairy because it is a big point, and it is kind of a complicated point in the middle of that. Because now we're going to take what they learn here, this limitation, and we're going to project that forward as we try to continue that growth, going into that last sort of aspirational phase. So we're going to draw these things together. But I want to start that by asking a question. And that question is, what is the difference between walking in the garden with God in the book of Genesis and being in the holy city or the new heaven and the new earth in the book of Revelation? Or maybe, let me phrase it better. What's the difference between how we live our faith from the original garden in the beginning to how we live our faith in the book of Revelation at the very end? Any ideas to what I'm getting at there? I don't really expect anyone to get it, but anyone has something they want to toss out?
And the garden was on earth, and the other...
That is one big difference in there, but not where I'm exactly going for. There's actually a couple of hymns that I'm going to put into this. The first one is, and he walked with me, and he talked with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Right, we all know that hymn. That's the famous Andy hymn, right? I'd say it because I have a good friend named Andy. Andy walks with... Anyway. But compare that one... Sorry, dear. But compare that to another hymn that we know really well. I am the church, you are the church, we are the church together. All who follow Jesus all around the world, yes, we're the church together. I like how John writes about this in Revelation. This is Revelation chapter 21. So John of Patmos, as he is recounting his vision, there's only 22 chapters in Revelation, so we're coming to the end of this. And he writes about this part of his vision. He says, and listen for where the emphasis is. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, look, God's dwelling is here with humankind. He will dwell with them, and they will be his peoples. God himself will be with them as their God. Do you hear all the plurals in there? All about the groups of people. In the garden in Genesis, it's described as being kind of one-on-one, and we're on our own, and we are completely and totally dependent upon God, and yet we have the ability to mess things up, and we do. We get all the way to Revelation, and at the end of that, we have learned a lot. We have gone through all of those phases. We have learned and we have grown, and there is so much that we can do on our own at that point. But the most important feature that we finally have figured out is that we are limited, we are going to mess things up, and most importantly in all of that, that it is through God's grace that we can get through it, that we can come out onto the other side. That we may be limited individually on our own, but we are limited differently from one another, so that when we come together, we can figure out how this works through God's grace. In the holy city, what becomes different is that we are still limited because we will never be God, so we will never be perfect at anything, but we stop focusing on our limitations. And not just that, we stop focusing on the limitations of others. as if we're honest with ourselves, that's where we spend a lot of our time. We like to focus on what others can or cannot do, right? And that becomes the defining boundaries of what we think is possible. But when we stop focusing on the limitations, then we can find that collaboration to do something new and different. When we are limited by and defined by sin and the limitations that we have and the limitations that others have, we hold those things against one another, and that inherently limits who we are. In the holy city, in the New Jerusalem, that will no longer be true. Those things will still be a part of us. We are still going to have our limitations, but we're going to be okay with that. They won't be at our expense. They won't be the things that define us anymore. And we will live in a state of full collaboration with God and with others to do something the likes of which we have never seen before. That's where we're headed. But what does that mean for us now? For now, that means that we're still back kind of where the early church was in Acts chapter 6. Kind of figuring out, how do we expand our leadership out? How do we reach out and share that with others so they can reach out and do the same? And it feels like in so many ways we still have a long way to go. But the advantage we have through faith is that we know where it is that we are headed. And by that I don't mean that we've gotten our tickets punched and we're getting into heaven, but we know where we're headed and the things and the characteristics of what that will be like. And so we can start living like that now through God's grace. Not focusing on the limitations and the fallibilities and the limits of what we can do, but we can start to live in that collaboration, in that coming together, in that figuring that out, recognizing that we will always be who we are, but that doesn't have to be the thing that holds us back, that through God's grace we can go out and be more, we can do different, that there is still all of that potential for growth that is out there, recognizing we're still going to hit those crisis points that are out there. That's the world we live in. Those things are going to come. But we know that we can make it through them. More specifically, how we do that, sign up for a listening session. Help us figure out who we are and where things are going to go in the future. Spend some time going back and reflecting on these questions. There's a reason why I left those questions up there every time I pulled this slide up. Reflect on who we are and what we're doing. And know that as we come together, we're all going to come together differently, and that's okay. Because it's through those differences that we'll actually find what we need to make it through the crises when they come. And all of that bound together by God's grace. Let us go, let us be those people. Let us live in that direction as we go from here. Let us do that in Christ's name.